Good morning. Good morning. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this plenary session on rigorous, responsible, and reproducible science. I'm delighted to be here to welcome you. I hope yesterday you enjoyed the very first day of IDW, and I myself enjoyed it very much. I hope you did too. And also, we want to start with the acknowledgement of country, and so that we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians. Yesterday we had a wonderful first plenary talking about indigenous data. And today we have this session on, as I said, rigorous, responsible, and reproducible science, but it's in the context of a time where we have new types of data to conduct our science, and also we have new methods, and the methods are based on data science, based on AI models. And in this new paradigm, it is very more important than ever to still remember that what we're doing is science, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, computational, or based on AI models. We still do science, and that's based on the foundations of science. We want to make sure that it's trustworthy, and to be trustworthy, the importance of this rigor and transparency, responsibility, but also science that is verifiable by others is essential, right? So we will start this plenary. Just first, I'll let you know a little bit about the format of the session. So we will have three speakers, three excellent speakers. I'm really happy to have here with us. Agnes is not here with us, but is online. I will give the talk on that. So Agnes Kiragga, Anna Arjona, and Juliet, Gerard. I'll introduce each one of them before their talk, and you will see what an incredible curriculum, professional careers they have. So it's wonderful to have them, the three of them, to talk about this topic from different perspectives. We have first Agnes Kiragga. So Agnes leads the data science program at the African Population Health Research Center in Nairobi, in Kenya. She has 20 years of experience working with different types of data. She has focused a lot on the African. Hi, Agnes. I see you here. Hi. You will see her in a moment. So working on various data mostly from Africa, and especially from the African longitudinal population cohorts. She also leads the Data Science Without Borders, which is a multi-country project that it builds on the INSPIRE, which is the implementation network for sharing population information from research entities, and in which CODATA is a technical partner of. Her work has always cared or aimed to use data and data science in real world challenges, and also with a focus on data generated in Africa. So we're really happy to have Agnes here. Sorry that you cannot be present with us, but we see you now, and we see your slides. So Agnes, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm glad that you can see me. It's unfortunate I'm not there, but I'm there in spirit. I can see the great attendance, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to talk. It's 2 a.m. here, but I'll try and keep very awake throughout the session. So as a background, I represent the African Population and Health Research Center, which is based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I know some of my colleagues are there. Thank you for representing the center and traveling all the way from Nairobi. So APHRC is Based in Nairobi, we aim to transform lives, and our mission is to generate evidence and strengthen research and related capacity in the African research and development ecosystem. And we do engage a lot of policy legislators so that all our work and research informs action, particularly in health and development. To date, the center has a footprint in about 35 African countries, and this is through a very strong partnership model. We do have a background of units and themes and programs that support over 200 researchers at the center. So our work really speaks to inform the African ecosystem. And I thought I would also provide a glimpse of what our research programs are. I'm pretty sure you'll see more from our colleagues who are presenting later today. But we have a health and well-being program, which looks at everything to do with health. We also have a human development program looking at early childhood, youth, and many other forms of research around gender and education and technology. Our third programmatic research area is population dynamics and urbanization. We look at work around migration, urbanization, equality, and many others. And the data science program, which is the youngest and where we are all coming from, is the data science program, which is looking at anywhere from developing platforms, architecture, looking at issues of governance and data sharing, standards, making data fair, and of course, the leveraging generative AI and other tools, data science and mathematical modeling to inform the evidence that we generate at the center. So before I dive into my talk, I wanted to provide just a brief background of where we see the future of artificial intelligence in Africa. And like Mercè said, there was a lot of talks on the role of AI in the yesterday's session. And in Africa, it's not any different. It has been estimated that we'll see, AI has the potential to grow the continent's economy by an estimated $2.9 billion by 2030. And this is definitely going to enhance the positioning of African health institutions to expedite AI adoption and realize its benefits. There's a lot of opportunities to use AI from health, public health, and any other kind of frameworks that are needed to support the greater health burden in the continent. And all this definitely is based on the availability of data. Somebody said if instead of garbage in, garbage out, with the AI, if there's data that's not clean, there's a disaster out. So garbage in, disaster out, because the models that are dependent on the data definitely can do a greater harm if the data is not available or not correct or not representative. So data remains a critical component of the AI development. And if you look at the enablers of AI in Africa, there was a recent survey by the Afritech, and that is the radar plot on the left. There are critical pillars. Governance remains important. Data, of course, is a critical component. Digital infrastructure, talent as one of the equally important enablers that need to be invested in, and many other, of course, energy, funding, and of course the research and innovations that will really tap into the AI models and AI development. And currently, if you look at where the priority sectors are in Africa, the greatest is agriculture, which is highlighted. We also see government services being really top on the list of how AI can help the services. We also have health, which if you look at the top, the list there, these three are the top priority sectors for AI infusion and AI deployment in the African context. I guess it reflects what is happening on the global environment as well. But if we are to look and to promote AI and have it support the different sectors or priority sectors that I've listed before, we need the data. And this is an interesting map that came up around 3 years ago. And it was looking at the data sets in Africa. Where are the data sets? Where is the data that is going to really feed into these AI models and the leveraging the AI tools? The African context is that thin, narrow part of the concept that's really shown there. And we need to see more and more data sets that are being readily available, and opportunities and networks like the Ecodata, the science community are going to enhance the visibility, the availability, the standardization of African data sets if we are to have them more represented in AI and also AI models and tools. And this was a recent quote by the Africa Union ambassador, which happened at the UNGA, the UNGA meeting in New York. She said, the hand that holds Africa's data will be the hand that will drive Africa's future. So we need to have the data sets in places where they will be managed, shared responsibly, and also used ethically to develop innovations that will drive the future, in addition to ensuring that they are of good quality. Again, when you look at the data availability and the quality, if you look at the African map and just looking at where are the basic data points like birth registration, death registration, there's a lot of diversity on the continent. Some countries have gone all the way to have almost nearly complete birth and death registration, while many parts of the continent remain gray. For example, the death registration with no unique identifiers, and collapsing on some of the civil registration vital statistics systems. It's important that basic data that will inform all the innovations has to be of the right quality and readily available. And if, again, in the AI context, if you look at the languages that are being used for developing some of the AI tools, less than 1% of African languages are represented in LLMs. Africa has 2,000 languages, but very, very few. Only 100 of these have actually been uploaded in Google. So there's still a lot to be done, but it's very promising. It's not the end. It's just the start of a very long, exciting journey on the continent. And it's against that backdrop that we also realize this has to match with the existing AI strategies. There are over 54 countries. To date, only 16 of these countries have enacted or have developed national strategies and AI frameworks, and the other countries remain inactive or on the roadmap to ensure that these are really developed as we move as a continent to promote AI and its use. And definitely the role of government is going to be critical, as we've seen, in being the greater custodian of these AI frameworks and making sure that what is in there is actually implemented. So against that backdrop, we have the Data Science Without Borders project. That's one of the data science projects at APHRC. We work with very many partners. I'll start to acknowledge Codata, who is been a very strong partner. We have the OSPO now, which is Open Science Program of. We also have the Mercè Artificial Intelligence Lab in Uganda, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And through this partnership, we aimed to strengthen data systems in Africa. We also aim to create an open and sustainable environment for a collaborative, replicable, and transferable application of AI and data science tools, and also to overcome some of the challenges of data governance and diversity in maturity of data protection laws and frameworks for effective sharing of data. We aim to develop federated analysis in our 3 implementing countries, which are in Ethiopia, Cameroon, and Senegal. And the 3 institutions we work with are listed on the map. So what we began to do as the DSWB, as I referred to it after, was to understand the ecosystem in these 3 institutions. The one in Ethiopia, which is a research institution, the one in Cameroon, which is a referral hospital, and the one in Senegal, which is a public-private entity, which is looking at HIV programming and many other researches in Senegal, West Africa. So we decided to understand the ecosystem in these 3 institutions, which were a bit diverse. We looked at the regulatory frameworks, looked at areas where we can harmonize data governance. We looked at how do these institutions invest in sustainable and scalable infrastructure. We also attempted to analyze and establish the data access and use through the collaboration that we had, and also identify real life opportunities to use data science and AI analytics to create solutions that really spoke to the three institutions that are in this consortium. And what we've done as the DSWB project is to do a comprehensive needs assessment in these three centers, which really highlighted critical gaps and gave us the roadmap to have this 3-year funded project running. We established the data maturity stages using a toolkit that I'll share shortly. We understood the institutional capacity needs. We went ahead to map at least close to 40 data sets that were available in this consortium. How many are available to be put on the table for cross-country analysis? How many are willing? How many of these data sets were available and mapped and made fair and also documented, and at least have the metadata published somewhere in some of the international repositories. Of course, we realized we needed to have our third objective, federation, in place. So we also tried to understand which data sets could be used as use cases. And all this process really helped us create a roadmap for strengthening the data systems in these three institutions. And those are different site visits to the three institutions, which is critical when you are actually running a multi-country collaboration. When we came to assessing the data systems in Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Senegal, we realized there was quite different stages of data maturity, looking at the whole ecosystem. Ethiopia was proactive, there was data being used, governance was being defined, but there were still opportunities to really have more collaboration as the consortium. In Senegal, there was primary data that was understood, it was stable condition, there were informal roles, lots of, some data was being used, some remained underutilized for any kind of analysis. And then in Cameroon, we realized there was need to have a staggered approach to have more digitalized systems to support AI and other tools that we thought would use in the consortium. So there was varying data maturity, specialized needs and strengthening, and also we needed to customize our support for data science in the three countries. Moving forward, we then invested in a lot of trainings with support of our partners, the London School, Codata, doing trainings in making data fair, creating common data models for standardizing some of the data sets. We introduced OMOP in all these three countries. We also had very many specific trainings to the hospital staff in Cameroon on what is data science, how can we document our data, how can we have data harmonized. And to date, we have onboarded 15 fellows through this consortium and ensuring that there will be the next pillars and the next workforce to drive this consortium to even more countries on the continent. In terms of innovations, the consortium has actually held two hackathons, and these were really specific to the needs that each country put at the table. In Ethiopia, they were keen to have a record linkage tool that assessed the records, that linked information of residents who are part of a health and demographic surveillance site and linking their data with records in hospitals where they seek care within these surveillance sites. And this is a challenge in Africa where we don't have unique identifiers and record linkage remains a problem. So we used AI tools to create a record linkage tool in Ethiopia. In Cameroon, the demand was an AI-powered blood donation surveillance system. This was held by, again, young scholars from different partner institutions, Ministry of Health, and other partners to look at how can we create a very informative, predictive tool that can help them coordinate their stock of blood in the center. And in Ethiopia, in Senegal, we are running another AI-driven tool for cervical cancer screening. So as I come towards the end, we also realized there was need to map unique and cross-cutting data sets that will support our opportunity of the feasibility of federation and having the analysis go to the sites rather than pulling the data sets together. And to date, we are working very closely with the Data Shield community, which I think might be well known to the audience. It's a software that performs non-disclosive analysis without needing to centralize the data. We have identified 3 unique data sets that are cross-cutting in the 3 countries, and we are going to use this to show and improve the application of Data Shield and other federated software to analyze these research questions in the 3 countries. As you can see, there's not much going on in the continent, and we hope that this will be a good use case. And this is the plan. We have installed Data Shield Opal servers in the 3 institutions. The code remains in Nairobi, where the researchers will be based, and the code will be sent to the 3 African countries. We'll run a collaborative analysis, and the aggregate results or the model weights will be sent back to the researcher. So this is work that's ongoing, and we're also keen to see partners and collaborators to help us walk this journey, as it's a new opportunity for us in the continent. In terms of governance beyond the institutions, we work very closely with continental bodies. We've held continental engagements with the African Union, with the Pan-African Parliament. We supported the Africa Digital Parliamentary Summit. We were at the UN, the New York meeting to again continue the discussion around AI governance in Africa and how can we strengthen Africa's position in the global AI governance debates. We continue to promote this through our program and also other collaborators. So as I end, there are very many lessons learned that we've had in the Data Science Without Borders project. Governance comes before technology, and there's a lot of trust that needs to happen if we are to have data move within different countries. There's need for robust systems for real-time improvements, for data quality and analysis. And we've also seen we need to tailor the support. We need to tailor the training. We need to understand each institution. As we have AI rolling very fast, we also need to take a stock. What does each country, what does each institution have? Where do we plug in? And how can we leapfrog, but at the same time, building the structures that are going to be critical for sustained use of AI? Policy engagement remains critical. If you look at AI governance frameworks in the continent, we have a continental AI strategy, but there's need for, again, leveraging some of the advancements, for example, the EU AI strategy and benchmarking and using this to enhance the continental governance efforts. And of course, partnerships are going to be important to amplify our impact, connect our local actions to the global community, and opportunities like Codata and other environments are going to be very critical for us as we continue to have responsible use of AI and promote data science in the African continent. So I just want to thank the organizers and our funders who are welcome and our partners who have been walking this journey on our project. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you, Agnes, for many things. First, for being up at these off hours. Your talk was excellent, and congratulations. Well, thanks for all the work you're doing. I mean, congratulations on bringing AI in this way. Well, not only AI, but all the components needed. That AI starts with data, right? And all you're bringing the data systems with the data shield, also the environment to make the use of data, good quality data, reality. So congratulations. We will, Agnes will stay with us for the final panel. So we will go into the next speaker, but if you have questions, hold them, write them down, so that we can have all the questions at the end of the three talks, okay? The next talk is by Arjona. Anna, another excellent speaker. I'm very delighted to introduce Anna. And we're going also not only to another speaker, but to another continent, right, in some way, on the topic. But Anna Arjona is the professor, well, assistant professor in political science, Northwestern University, is co-editor-in-chief of the journal Perspectives on Politics, and founding director of the Network of Studies on Drugs in Latin America, the REDESTAL. She got her PhD in Yale University in political science and has been a fellow several places at the Ayers Institute at Columbia University, the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame, at the Kaplan Institute for Humanities at Northwestern University. And she served as director of the Center for the Study of Security and Drugs at La Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, where she's from. And she was visiting there in the School of Economics. So Anna, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation again. It's a pleasure to share these ideas with you. So I'm going to be talking about the urgency of validating data in the social sciences, and I'll give you an example on a topic that I have worked on a lot, which is the study of civil war. And I know this will be sort of like a very distant topic for you or for many of you, but I hope you will be able to see how important and consequential it can be when we use data in a way that it's not appropriate or without validating it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just introduce what I think is the problem. Then I'll introduce the argument, which is actually very simple and brief. And then I'll give you an illustration with the study of civil war, and then I'll conclude with some ideas to move forward. So when we think about data validation in the social sciences and what is usually discussed, there are two things that stand out. The first one is trying to improve methodological techniques for assessing data quality, right? And this is mostly in terms of measurement error. So we want to make sure that there are no big reasons why our data are biased. And then we have a lot of work on trying to refine data cleaning procedures. We pay less attention to what in the social sciences we call construct validity. Is the data measuring what we think it is measuring? Is the match between our theoretical construct or concepts or whatever we want to call it and the data actually, is there a fit? Are we really looking for the data that capture the phenomenon of interest? So sometimes the data that we need to measure what we are thinking about is very obvious. And you can think of many examples where you think of a phenomenon or a concept, and the data that you need to measure it is very obvious. But sometimes it may seem obvious, but if you are a real expert in the topic, you may realize that actually it's not that obvious, that maybe the data that you're using is not really capturing the phenomenon as you intend. Sometimes scholars know that they don't have a direct measure because they are experts, they understand that there is a distance between the concept and the data, but sometimes even if they know they are using a proxy, they don't validate it. They know it's a proxy, they know it's not perfect, but they don't validate it. They just assume that it's fine to use it and move on. So the problem is, first, there is low awareness of the importance of the problem of construct validity. We think a lot about measurement error, but we don't think enough about the problem of construct validity. And the second problem that is related to this is, despite the awareness about the importance of measurement error, a lot of times we use data without validating it, without really knowing how pervasive and how important measurement error is. With big data and AI, we are facing bigger challenges in terms of both of these issues. There are a lot of off-the-shelf data sets that researchers and scholars and policymakers around the world can just download and use. And we're doing so in many topics, in many fields, in a very irreflective way. We are assuming we have good data to measure the things that we think we're measuring, but they are not really good measures. So the argument that I want to make today, and I think this may apply better to some fields than to others, the first one is that we need theoretical expertise. And this may seem very obvious and very sort of like unnecessary to say, but at least in the social sciences, because we have more and more data and we focus a lot on methods, we are forgetting that theoretical expertise is essential for us to even know if the data that we're using is the right data. So we really need to justify the proxies and the measures that we use are, in fact, the right proxies for what we are trying to do with our research or our policy analysis. The second point, which again may seem obvious and maybe it's very clear in our minds, but maybe not so much in our practice, is that case or contextual expertise is essential for us to know is a specific piece of data from that source in that country or in that city or in that area is actually good for the purposes of our research or our analysis. And so the importance of validating this data empirically is even greater when we know that there are so many data available on so many topics. We should compare the data that we're trying to use that are proxies with direct measures of the concept or the phenomena that we're trying to measure, even if that entails or requires collecting new data on a subsample of cases or a subsample of units. And the proposal that I want to make is that journals, which are very important in the whole process of research, and different academic communities or research communities require data validation the first time that a proxy is used to measure a specific phenomenon or construct. So once one piece of data, once one proxy is validated, it's fine for all of us to go and do more research with it. But the first time that it is used, we should require validation before we accept it as a valid proxy. So as I said, I'm going to illustrate the problems with one topic that I think it's evidently important, but I'll remind you of why it matters. In addition of the cases that you can think of in the last few years or even in this century, actually about half of the countries in the world have endured a civil war in the last 70 years, which may be shocking, but that's the case. So it is a phenomenon that can have a lot of impact, not only throughout the conflict, but also in terms of the legacies. So we really have reasons to try to understand how these wars are fought, what are their impacts during war, and also what are their consequences. So when I mention the term civil war, probably 99.9% of you are going to be thinking about violence. And it makes sense, right? Violence is the main reason why we think of civil war and peace as two distinct states of affairs, right? If I have a data set of all the countries in the world since 1950, and I try to code them as having a civil war or not every year, what do I look at? I look at data on violence. We also need a few other criteria, right? You need to have the state being one of the warring sides and another side being a challenger of the state. But beyond that, what qualifies a case as a civil war is violence. It's basically a threshold of battle-related deaths. That's how, in a lot of disciplines, we define and operationalize civil war. So it makes sense. It's the most notable aspect of the war. When we think about civil war within a country, so you can think about Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, or Colombia, the country that I'm going to be talking about, you may be interested in knowing within the country, how is the civil war impacting people or institutions or the state? Or if you are thinking about policy and counterinsurgency during the war, you may be interested in knowing exactly where these groups are operating. Or if you are thinking about humanitarian intervention, you may be interested in knowing where are the populations that are really dealing with this phenomenon, with this shock that is a civil war. So how do we measure the occurrence of civil war or the exposure to civil war within a country? Well, we usually use data on violence for the same reasons, right? Because if you think about any of these countries and I try to ask you, okay, where is the civil war happening or where are people being exposed to the civil war within the country, you are going to say, well, show me, I don't know, data on homicides or massacres or bombs, right? So this is usually what happens. There is a lot of research trying to understand the dynamics of civil war, how these conflicts are fought, and also the impact on populations. And then we also try to understand the legacies. Once a civil war is over, what are the legacies? What happened to people, to health, to education, to institutions? So what we usually do is we have data, which is increasingly available, on all kinds of violent incidences, and we use that as a proxy of the presence of armed groups, right? We want to know where these groups have been operating over time. We use this data, and we assume that wherever we see violence, that's where the groups are operating. Importantly, we also make the assumption that wherever there is no violence, these groups were not operating. These are not areas in the country that were exposed to the civil war. The big problem is this proxy of armed group presence is seldom validated. And this has very important implications for both research and policy. So I mentioned before that my argument and my proposal is that we need to remind and especially teach young researchers that theoretical expertise matters. That if someone is a real expert on this topic, they should be able to think carefully before we even try to use some data if it could be a good proxy. So I'm not going to give you a lecture on civil wars, but I think I can show you intuitively why violence may not be a great proxy. This is a map that tries to capture the distribution of territorial control. This is military control between the Taliban, when the Taliban was a rebel group, not the government, and the government, and where the territory was contested. This is from the BBC for July of 2025. As you can see, there is a lot of variation, right? All over the country, you have these provinces that are either controlled by the Taliban or controlled by the government or under dispute. So this is how civil wars are fought for the most part, right? These civil wars that have guerrilla fighters or insurgents that are fighting a stronger army that represents the government. These groups usually fight trying to control territories. That's sort of like the logic of the game. They are trying to really hold onto these territories and expand. In order to control these territories, they use violence. Yes, obviously, they use violence. But they also try to mobilize civilians. They often help civilians. And they even become de facto rulers. They often become the government in these places. Maybe it's not an established government, maybe it's not formal, maybe it's not recognized by the international community, but these groups are the ones that are settling disputes, that are providing public goods, the ones that are punishing teenagers that are misbehaving or abusive husbands. So civil war is really about a lot more than violence, right? So based on this theoretical expertise, I can tell you that we know one of the most well-established hypotheses to understand violence in civil war within countries is that when these groups already have military control, they don't need a lot of violence, right? So when they are really strong, it's when they really do not need to be killing civilians. Second, if the presence of these groups is reducing the state capacity, then the ability of the state to record violent incidents is going to go down. And third, in places where rebels govern, where they operate as a de facto ruler, they really need less violence to hold this social, economic, and political control over the community and the territory. Oh, and importantly, they also may have very few incentives to report violence when it happens, because the rebel group is actually the authority. It controls a lot of things. So even if I'm harmed, even if my kid was threatened or killed, I may not have incentives to report it. I also talked about the importance of empirical expertise or case expertise. So in this context, with this data, is it likely to work for my construct or for my conceptualization? So again, we're talking about what is the right way to measure the presence of armed groups within a country. So I'm going to talk about Colombia. I'm not going to give you a lot of details, but just remind you, you may have seen in the news in the last few years, this was a very long civil war that lasted for about 60 years. It entailed the state, guerrilla fighters, left-wing guerrilla fighters, and pro-state paramilitary groups. This is a very, very data-rich country. There are a lot of data sets around, which people download and use a lot to study very important questions. And there have been very highly influential papers written by economists and political scientists on civil war with data on Colombia. How am I doing with time? I don't see the clock here, but just if you can let me know when I have 5 minutes. Thank you. So this is some data that I have collected. I have done a lot of field work in Colombia, where I'm from, trying to understand how armed groups arrive to these territories, how they govern communities, how communities respond. And this is just one slide showing you some of the things these groups do. I'm showing you over the life of the conflict, which is different for different communities. Some communities have had these groups present for 5 years, some have had it for 15 years, for 20 years. I have collected data at the very sort of local level, community level, trying to see what these groups were doing, what roles they adopted in terms of governance. So as you can see here, I won't go through all of them, but they did a lot of things, right? And then there's a lot of variation. So for example, in about 35% of the cases, they were regulating a lot of economic activities. If you look at the political realm, they were the ones who were running things. They adjudicated disputes among neighbors. They influenced elections because Colombia had democracy at the same time as the Civil War. They also regulated a lot of social interactions and behaviors, including how people could wear, how they could dress, or how to punish domestic violence. They provided or intervened in the provision of services like education and health. And they also interacted closely with civilians. And I show this so that you sort of have a sense of how important the presence of these groups might be in the community. Very often they were having beer with locals or playing soccer with them, which of course in Colombia it's a very good proxy of interaction, right? So violence may not be a very good proxy of armed group presence, because in a lot of these places, these groups were able to govern, and once they governed, they didn't need to use constant violence to preserve control. They may have needed it at the beginning. I'm not saying that they don't use violence, and I'm not romanticizing war zones, right? What I'm saying is they may be very strong in a place and not really use violence at all. So how could we validate the data? I'm going to show you how, if we have this data, which is a proxy of armed group presence, which is violence, if we compare it with data collected in the field, asking people, and I can talk more about the methodology if anyone is interested, but asking people about which groups were present when, we could validate to what extent violence can really capture armed group presence. And if there is measurement error, maybe we can try to find if it's systematic or not, and that can give us ideas of how we could or could not use the data. So I'm going to talk about three famous data sets. I'm not going to give you details, but I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A, that have been widely used in academic research. Oops. Okay. So here I'm just going to show you the percentage of municipality years, or like county years, where if you look at these data sets on violence, there is no violence registered, but based on this fieldwork, we know the guerrillas were there, right? And this is just the data for the three data sets, and you can see between 26 and 63% of the cases, again, of the municipality years, are cases where there is no violence registered, but based on what people reported on the ground, the groups were present, right? How about paramilitary violence? Well, this actually can go up to 80%. And I mentioned that paramilitaries are pro-state, or were pro-state militias. This is quite high. Is measurement error systematic or random? So I'll just give you one figure that shows variation of this measurement error across regions within the country. And that alone must show you that this is not random. Something is going on that makes it more likely that you capture presence with violence or not in one region or the other. Okay, so far I have shown that this data on violence systematically misses armed group presence. And then when we think we are measuring exposure to the war or exposure to the armed groups, we are not. We're just measuring violent incidents, which is a much narrower phenomenon. So what are the consequences? I'll give you two examples. This is a paper by very influential economists. Two of them actually have the Nobel Prize in economics, that looks at the impact or the consequences of paramilitary presence on election results. And all I want to highlight here is that if I take their data and cross it with the cases for which I have data on armed group presence, 52% of the cases where in my data there are paramilitary groups present show up as having no presence in their study. And I'm not saying this invalidates their findings. I'm saying we don't know that we are not exactly capturing what we think we are, and this can undermine knowledge production. I'll give you another example. If we think about the legacies of living under the presence of these groups and under these forms of governance, we may want to know if in the long term people are still affected by it. One important outcome of interest is how free people feel, how much they feel they have basic rights and freedoms. So if I look at places in Colombia where armed groups used to operate about 8 years ago, but they are not there anymore, and I look at variation across communities where there was violence and places where there was no violence, we don't find that people feel differently about their rights or freedom. If we look at actual data on arm group presence, we find a significant variation or difference across these domains for each of the types of freedom. So 8 years after these groups are gone, people are still feeling less free in many domains. The same happens with policy. If we want to know which places really need attention and we look at violence, that's a very different conclusion than if we look at armed group presence. So, to conclude, moving forward. As I said before, I think we should require that the first time a proxy is used for a specific construct or phenomenon, we should validate it. This should include a theoretical justification, a contextual or case justification, and empirical validation. And what I think we collectively can do is help to develop guidance for scholars and researchers for how to validate their data. For example, we can devise ways of collecting new data in a subsample of cases, and then that we can use this to validate data on a much larger population. We can also rely more on data that is already collected, and for this I think we have to create incentives for data sharing. A lot of this is going to be on cases. And then improving our use of AI tools to code qualitative data that can then allow us to validate the data that we use. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. What an insightful and interesting talk. It's wonderful to see that the work that Anna does, but also to put it in the context of this rigorous and responsible science, which means data quality and data validation. I mean, being aware of that and how do we make sure that we check that in our research and we don't fall or we're cautious of hyper-empirism, right? Where we're thinking that theory is not needed anymore. So it's not only data, we need the theory and the right data for the problem. So now we go into the next talk with Juliet, Gerard. I'm also, again, delighted to have all these speakers that are, and just, it's an honor to be able to share this plenary with them. So Juliet also has an incredible career. She's a professor at the University of Auckland, and she has chaired the Marsden Council, served on the board of directors of Plant and Food Research, and is currently on the board of the Te Papa, the National Museum of New Zealand, and the New Zealand Food Waste Champions. During her years, 6 years in fact, as the Prime Minister's of Chief Science Advisor in New Zealand, she supported the science community to provide advice to the PM, but also the ministers and to the public in general on a wide range of topics. And she was at the time that had to provide also advice during the response to the Wakari White Island eruption, right? Also during the COVID pandemic. Also rethinking about plastics, about commercial fishing and on food waste. So Juliet has had all this time an interest in strengthening the connectivity between researchers and policy. And in fact, we'll talk about this topic today. And well, we look forward to hearing her talk. Welcome. Welcome, Juliet.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction. That's great to be in Brisbane. I haven't been for a while. So, as was mentioned in the intro, I spent 6 years from 2018 to 2024 advising 3 Prime Ministers of New Zealand, so Jacinda Ardern, Chris Hipkins, and Chris Luxon, and it was a secondment. So I was lucky enough to land back at the University of Auckland, and they gave me a year sabbatical, during which I have written a book which is currently with the publishers on what I learned during that time, looking at all the different projects that we worked on, which were many and varied. It's a very dangerous thing to do, to give someone 20 minutes when they've just finished a book, but I promise I'll keep to time. So what I thought I might do is just pull out two sets of thoughts that have informed my thinking as I've reflected slowly on some work that was often done at pace. First of all, some guiding principles that we use to guide our work throughout the 6 years. I've affectionately called them RETA. Some of them will be very familiar to this audience, others maybe less so. And then some brief thoughts on when science advice is more effective and when maybe it's more challenging. And just as a caveat, I use science throughout this talk to encapture anything that's rigorously collected. So I'm using the broadest definition possible and try not to get snarled up in that definition. The job title said Chief Science Advisor, not Chief Evidence Advisor, and it's a bit rude to change your own job title, but we certainly interpreted the word science very broadly during the whole time. So just before I started in this role, a fantastic paper was published, and I've put the reference up there for you. It's short and clear, and it remains the most useful short article I've come across, summarizing principles that are useful for synthesizing evidence in its broadest sense to inform policy. My contribution has been to rearrange them so they spell RETA. So RETA became my friend during the 6 years. And RETA is there to help enable practice and relationship building that builds trust. So I'll just reflect on each of those briefly. First of all, rigor. It's taken as read, and I don't need to talk to this audience about rigor, but it's worth stating up front, especially before I unpack the other principles, that if you're going to synthesize evidence to inform policy, it needs to be rigorous. If it's not rigorous, it's probably bad science, and it's probably bad for policy. And so ideally, as you guys know better than most people, we would be synthesizing a comprehensive body of evidence. We're appraising its quality as we go. We're analyzing it systematically, and it's peer-reviewed by all appropriate experts before delivery. But when you're in a position of advising prime ministers, ministers, senior officials in the messy and busy business of government, you might not have time to do that. And so some pragmatism needs to be overlaid. During COVID, there were genuine examples where people's rigorous processes were slowing down communication of information to the point that they weren't making the key cabinet meeting on time. So they were brilliantly rigorous, but 3 hours too late. So part of my job during some of those crises that were mentioned was short-circuiting that system, which is a dangerous thing to do, but sometimes in a crisis, a useful one. So knowing how rigorous it needs to be and when it's good enough and when actually it's not good enough and it should be withheld until after the decision is really important. All these things are easy to say and hard to do. And one of my reflections dealing with communities across all disciplines over 6 years is that, like beauty, rigor is very much in the eye of the beholder. And there are some people who are trained in their specific discipline and they are brilliant within their discipline, but they cannot see beyond the bounds of their own definition of rigor. And I think for many of the problems that face the world, where you might like to influence policy, building communities across disciplines is critical. And one of the success factors for building those communities is respecting each other's definition of rigor. Again, easy to say, hard to do. All requires a lot of good communication. I really enjoyed the previous talk about proxies, and it speaks to this next point, which is how important it is in developing your definition of rigor, not just to express what you know, but also what you don't know. It might be that you are using the best proxy available, but then you really need to acknowledge it's not that good a proxy, and then analyze whether it's better than nothing. So those measures of uncertainty are hugely important. And again, this is an audience that understands data bias. Bias is a tricky word in a government context. And if you say, sorry, this data's biased, what tends to be heard is not some failure of a probabilistic test, but rather it's been produced by someone who has an agenda. It's a very loaded word. Skew is maybe slightly better, but one of the things that was important in my role was to find ways to explain what that meant in context. And this lamppost analogy by Claire Craig, who's written a lovely book that I can give you the reference to if anyone's interested, is my favourite way of explaining it. So if you are coming out of the pub and heading to your car and you realise you've lost your car keys, you could have lost them anywhere on the route from the pub to the car, but you tend to look under the lamppost because you can see under the lamppost, even though it's no more likely to be under the lamppost than anywhere else. And little stories like that were really helpful to communicate some of the problems with data that we faced. So if you are advising on agricultural policy, you can find a lot of data from developed countries, not much from developing countries, and yet that might be where you really need to apply that knowledge. So understanding how relevant it is super interesting. And another thing that people often get caught up on is not having enough evidence. So if you come from a very rigorous training, you're a researcher, it's easy to say, we don't really know, we're within the margin of error, and that can be used politically to create far too much wiggle room. So I think it's important to encourage testing of hypotheses in policy, to be innovative and to evaluate interventions as you go so that you create that data and not let lack of evidence be a barrier to trying sensible actions. The second principle is inclusivity. If you identify and make use of a full range of evidence, it stands to reason that it's likely to be a stronger evidence synthesis, but it can be quite hard to deliver. We used a range of skills and people. We thought about experiences of other countries, but did or didn't they apply? And we tried as hard as we could to explicitly hear different voices, different worldviews, and to acknowledge different knowledge systems, especially in the New Zealand context, the Indigenous knowledge, Mātauranga Māori. We tried to include policymakers and stakeholders in our evidence gathering. Some people felt that as an independent advisory office, we should be isolated from those voices, but if we were working on commercial fishing, we talked to commercial fishers, we went out on the boats, we heard their stories. When we were working on a project to minimise gang harm, we talked to the people whose lives had been influenced, and that was really important. And in so doing, we tried to explicitly challenge the norms of evidence hierarchy, which tends to privilege the quantitative, even if the quantitative is using proxies that aren't valid. I tried, as I alluded to earlier, to avoid getting tangled up in what counted as science. Rather, we asked the question, is it useful? And we always contextualized any cited wisdom. So if it was just a few reckons from a few stakeholders, but it sounded quite good, we might include it in our report in the context saying, we heard from a few stakeholders. They felt heard, the information was out there. We weren't over-claiming the rigor of the data. And we also, as I'll get to in a minute, really tried to acknowledge the role of values and emotion in policy making, and that evidence is not the only factor. Rarely is it a large factor. COVID maybe gave it a high profile, but many policy decisions don't touch evidence. Maybe sad, but true. Transparency is a principle that I adopted with great gusto as I started, and I proved to have been very naive in how transparent it's possible to be when you're working that closely with a PM. Of course, the more transparency, the better, because it builds trust with communities. But if you go blurting on the television what you've just advised the Prime Minister before it's been considered by Cabinet, then you haven't built trust with the person receiving the advice. So there's a big balance to strike. But you can be absolutely transparent about the methods you're using, what you're working on, who you've consulted, explicitly acknowledge points of contest, and we always published our terms of reference at the beginning, so they were out there and were open as we possibly could be about the process being used. I chose to talk to the press only when I could be completely transparent. I didn't want to become a no-comment person because I thought that didn't build trust. So, for example, I advised very closely on the science in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. I only talked to the press after decisions had been made about the advice given, not before, because I didn't want to put the PM in a position where she was getting questions. Your science advisor said this, what are you going to do? Before the evidence had been considered. And that's a fairly hair-raising interview I did to explain the science behind the lockdown on the day we locked down, but after we'd done it. And you guys don't need a lecture on accessibility. You spent most of yesterday talking about it. It was great. I interpreted accessibility more broadly than in that paper I cited. Of course, the work needs to be accessible. It needs to be updatable. It needs to be written clearly so that everybody understands it, who needs to understand it. Maybe different audiences will need different languages, different styles, different tones. I also tried to make the culture of the office open. We listened to anyone that wasn't hostile, entirely subjective definition, but it worked well. And I tried to make myself personally accessible, which also made me very tired. But I think it was useful to always answer the phone if we could. That was not just me, but also the office. Sadly, open access to the public became quite tricky during COVID, but we did our best when people weren't hostile. So the second thing I'll just touch on is where we've got to in our thinking on what made the science advice we gave effective or otherwise. And the first lesson I learned was that the most effective science advice is delivered just ahead, but not too far ahead, of the policy agenda. If you're too far ahead of the policy agenda, no one's listening and it's gathering dust. And if you're behind the policy agenda, the policy's already set and no one's going to change it. So when decision makers and policy makers are thirsty for evidence, that's the time to be ready. Of course, you can keep your evidence up to date in the meantime and be ready to strike when the political winds change, which is a thought that we are clinging to in New Zealand sometimes. So the best example I've got of this working is actually the first project we did on what to do about recycling plastics, or not using plastics, or more widely just rethinking our relationship with plastic. This project was pre-COVID. There was a poll that went out in New Zealand that showed that the plastic problem was the #1 social and environmental concern amongst adults in New Zealand. It probably wasn't the biggest problem, but it was the one that was front of mind. So there was a public will to change, there was social license. The Prime Minister was keen to act on it. We were in a situation where we had the Green Party supporting the government, and they had a minister who was in charge of waste. So we had political wins, the policymakers had been told to act, they were thirsty for evidence, and we had a mountain of experts that wanted to help. So we drew on our extensive New Zealand research networks. We put together a small, hard-working panel supported by my team. We had broader input from a wider reference group. We let anybody access the draft and comment, which was a nice collaborative way to work for this project, which I don't recommend for more contentious projects. And if somebody buys me a wine, I'll tell them that story too. And we came up with a big, fat, long report. There's a thesis-length document with very detailed policy recommendations, which were welcomed. We worked closely with the officials at the Ministry for the Environment to keep them abreast of the evidence that was coming out, so that we didn't have that pause where they had to read and respond to our report. They knew what was coming. And those were our headline recommendations. This was the sort of how the world should be in science advice moment. We had a nice launch by the water. We had the Prime Minister. We had the Minister. We had lots of press. My favourite moment was a journalist trying to ring the plastics industry to get a counter view, and then being at the function saying, well, I'm just over here, so come and talk to me, because we'd heard those voices. And that's my favourite citation, H-index be damned, which was from the Governor-General opening Parliament saying they were going to adopt all our recommendations. And I have skited about that quite shamelessly because it didn't always happen. So science advice, as we all know, may be used, well used, misused, or completely ignored. So at the other end of the spectrum from our plastics project, we did a project on understanding harm caused by gangs in New Zealand. It was commissioned by one Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. She handed over to Chris Hipkins during a time when the policy agenda within the Labour Party, the governing party, was changing to be tougher on crime. I wouldn't like to mischaracterise his response, but that gave his handy. And the leader of the opposition, Chris Luxon, who shortly afterwards became my boss, was on the radio immediately after I had talked about this project and dismissed it out of hand before he'd read it. So that was not the best day. We were cited in the UK Times for all the wrong reasons, as having produced a report that was soundly rejected by the incoming government. So that didn't go so well. And that has led us to reflect on how you might understand how your advice is going to land before you give it. So this is something I've called the consensus quadrant that builds on the work of Roger Pilker and Claire Craig, and it tries to pull out problems in 2 dimensions. So scientific consensus, how sure we are, whether we've got warring disciplines saying different things or we're all on the same page, and values consensus. So for something like a major weather event, here a tornado, the science is really clear. We know where the tornado is going. We know what to do: stay inside, stay in a strong building, tie down your trampoline. You're in a good spot to be making evidence-based recommendations. But for something like abortion, you can have all the agreement and data in the world, and that decision is going to be made according to values. Everyone in this room has a strong values position on abortion, and quite rightly too, and the evidence is not likely to sway that decision. In the murky corner of the quadrant, we have illegal recreational drug taking, not much data because it's illegal, although it's growing in some places, and strong values positions driving decision making. So you may well get asked for advice in that corner of the quadrant because that's where politicians are struggling, but you need to understand that it's very hard to give solid evidence-based advice there. And because I like to complete the quadrant, there will be times when we all agree that we should do something like get out of the way of the asteroid, but the scientific community will not have the slightest clue what to do. And I'm really glad I'm not the science advisor when that comes around. So understanding where you are on that consensus quadrant maybe will help frame the project, work out how to communicate the project, and whether to make recommendations. So in my book, I've been doing lots of case studies and putting things on the quadrant to try and see whether it's helpful in how to go forward with new projects. Of course, you don't always stay put. And one of the things I've reflected on about our COVID experience is that we started off in asteroid territory. We didn't know what was happening. Everyone was afraid. We wanted something to be done. And ironically, the more we learned, the more the consensus grew on what we should do and what this virus was about, the more polarizing the response became. And perhaps being aware of that at the time would have helped us land some of that advice better. And so I wonder whether that quadrant might be useful for challenges ahead. Obviously, decision makers have different appetites for evidence. I was lucky to work for 3 prime ministers, all of whom wanted evidence, although with different appetites for the detail. Michael Gove there with Big Ben at the end is my poster boy for a leader that doesn't like evidence. He famously said that Britain had had enough of experts. And of course, when those people get elected, evidence isn't sought, and absence of evidence, we know, is not evidence of absence. So that's my favourite quote from Donald Trump. He's right, of course, that if you don't test for cases, you don't have any cases to report to the WHO, to your point earlier, but that's maybe not the best way to manage a pandemic. And how do we communicate all this nuance and uncertainty in an era when people who do not believe in evidence tend to be very certain and not acknowledge they might be wrong? So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Juliet. How wonderful it was to end with this talk, to reflect on all the topics, on the previous talks today and on the topic. And I invite Anna to come to also join the panel, and hopefully Agnes is still with us. So we will accept questions from the audience. Hello, but yeah, I will start. As we're collecting questions, I'll start with one question here for the panelists, and then I start gathering all of your questions, and maybe that was for Agnes. That was supposed to be here, but we imagine she's sitting here. Yes, first, yesterday we had a lovely session on early career researchers and very enthusiastic researchers that were showing their work and the ambitions. And I was thinking, as we're doing a reflection on this topic of rigorous, responsible, and reproducible science. So, what would you advise to them? What would be your few words to what we should be teaching, or what should we letting them know to start their career as they start their careers, and they probably will embark in these new methods, new types of data, right? New methods based on AI, data science, and new types of data that might not have been well validated yet. So, you wanna start, Anna?
Thank you. So part of my recommendations would be sounding like a broken record that theoretical expertise is very important. And again, this may be different across social sciences, medical sciences, but in some research areas, we are so focused on the data and the methods that we are forgetting that theoretical expertise is super important. And without theory, the data cannot really tell us enough. So I would advise early career researchers to make sure they are experts on what they are working on, and before they try to publish results, just make sure you have done the reading, make sure that you really, really have a good sense of what we know about a question before trying to move our research or our knowledge forward.
Right, extremely important. Seems very basic, but we forget sometimes, right? Yeah. So Agnes, I don't know if you hear us. Do you want to reply to this question?
Yes, a good question. I think for early career researchers, two things. One, I would say they need to be rooted in the right networks. It's important to be in the networks where some of the standards that will propel their career are really discussed. A quick question: if somebody is developing an AI tool, just an example, sometimes there's a tendency to be in your own corner. You don't even know what the guidelines are, what the standards are for effective development of some of these tools. So being rooted in critical networks so that they can learn and exchange ideas and tap from the experts is going to be important for them. The second thing is to take I think there's a tendency for early career researchers to really want very instant results without going through the process. It's important to understand the process, go through the principles of the particular career that you want to look at. If there are courses you have to do, if there are the steps that, if you reflect from other mentors that have walked this journey and trying to learn what steps they've taken, and piggybacking on that to ensure that as they walk their journey as early career researchers, they are also getting through the right process and not just jumping hurdles in a bid to really catch up. So I guess for me it's networks and going through the process, and of course being able and flexible to learn is going to be a very important critical skill for early career researchers.
Thank you, Agnes. So yes. Being a theoretical expert, also be in the right network, that if you don't have all the expertise on that subject, at least be in the network where there are the experts, right, to get the insights. And Juliet?
Yeah, I think I agree with all that. And I would add an overlay of patience. So I remember when I was an early career researcher, I used to want everything to happen in a hurry. And if you want data to influence decisions, that patience is needed, and also that pragmatism. So be completely grounded in your theory and your nerdy communities, but make sure you understand who you're communicating to and when is the best time to communicate.
Very good. Wonderful. So we're going to go into questions. There was one question here. Introduce yourself first. Just say your name and...
Hello, this was an excellent panel. My name is Claudia. I'm from the University of Campinas, Brazil, and I do have millions of questions for the three of you, but I'll just concentrate on one for one person, Anna. Wouldn't or can't you factor out the social sciences argument and say that your proxy argument applies to anything that concerns data, because what we call data is what we sample from the real world?
Thank you. Yes, I agree. I think I talk about the social sciences because that's what I think I understand better. But yeah, I guess every time we talk about data, we are talking about some representation in empirical world of an idea in our minds, right? And sometimes it's very clear that if I think about the fertility rate, my theoretical construct is just very close to the data that we can have, you know, how many children women have of a certain age or something like that. But for a lot of the topics that we investigate, and I agree, it doesn't apply just to social sciences, there is this distance, and we need so much more awareness and transparency about that distance and what can go wrong from these abstract concepts to the data that we can rely on to measure it. So yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
Hi, Kit Greenhill, ARDC. I'm just really interested in what mechanisms you'd see for evaluating these novel proxies. I think it's a great idea, but I'm just thinking with peer review being in disarray at the moment, how one would do something that seems so essential.
So I think we could collaborate to improve what we do. And the first one is, I think we need shared norms in our communities to say, yes, you have this amazing methodology in this very hot topic, but before you convince me of your findings, you have to convince me that the data are sound. And again, this is not, I'm not saying anything new, right? We all know this, but it's just the way in which we actually work. I think that if we, for example, the proposal that I was trying to make in the presentation is that if we were able to adopt something like a norm saying, if this is the first time that violence is being used to measure armed group presence, you first need to convince us, the research community, that this is a valid proxy. Maybe the second time and the 1,000th time that someone uses it, we don't need to do that. It would probably be ineffective, right? But the very first time, we could have these protocols where a data set is somewhere documented as a valid proxy for the construct. And here's where I think there is a lot of space for innovation and collaboration. So in the topics that I work on, a lot of qualitative researchers have just like so much data, you know, in cabinets that we don't use. But there are not a lot of incentives for sharing that data. For armed group presence, for example, I know a lot of people that I could go to and say, share your qualitative data. We're going to validate these proxies for whatever it is, armed group presence or something, or governance by these groups. And we're going to create incentives for you to share that data. So for example, one thing we could do is, if I am using for the first time this proxy, and I'm using qualitative work by 40 researchers around the world, and I validate this, every time this proxy is used, those people are cited. Because conducting this in-depth fieldwork in conflict zones is really complicated, and we want to create like the system where we reward and recognize this work. So maybe if, even as an early career scholar, I collected all this qualitative data, I know that if I share it with a quantitative person who is going to analyze it and use it, I have incentives to say, you know, here is in a very transparent way all my data. There are a lot of things we have to think through, but, and then I'll be recognized for this. That's one idea.
Yes, and Yes, and as many, well, in a conference like that, as many of us have worked on data citation and recognition for sharing those data sets, but also in the metadata that perhaps can describe, I mean, even yesterday there were some talks about the data quality, data context, a model, there is a poster, I believe, on that, the context of the data and how you describe it in a structured way that could help for others to, well, to this first index of the proxy that then others will use, but yeah, define it. Yeah.
Sorry, just one more thing where I think people who work on the statistics could really help us is, for some of this validation, we may have good data on the actual phenomenon in a biased sample of cases, for example, right? So how can we, if we know that it's very costly, very difficult to collect this data, maybe we need better guidances of how, if you have only data on certain types of communities or certain types of contexts, how can we estimate the likelihood of measurement error for this proxy as well, right? So it's not just that the data may not be out there. I mean, we could collect new data if it's possible. If it's not, can we improve our understanding of the limitations of this data? There is someone, Sarah Moore, is working, for example, on trying to propose ways of validating this.
Yes, I agree. We'll go to the next question.
We have a question here. No.
Okay. Hi. Thank you, everyone, for that absolutely excellent panel. My name is Natalie Harrower. I'm with the Canadian Research Data Centre Network. I was hanging on every word you said, Professor Gerard, because the research infrastructure that I lead supports social science researchers to work with national statistical data to look across a range of social science questions. But the real purpose is to then try to provide the evidence to help inform policy. So you may not be the best person to ask this question because you had a bit of an in with the government, obviously. But do you have any advice about how researchers or the networks that support them can actually try to get the evidence that they find in front of policymakers? Because I hear from both sides. The policymakers want it, the researchers want it. Making that connection is very difficult. Thank you.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time thinking about that and trying to invest some resource in building deeper and more resilient communities across the researcher policy interface. And I think one thing researchers can do in particular is develop a better understanding of the policy process and the machinery of government and how nuanced it is. And understanding windows when there are opportunities to put evidence in front of usually policymakers rather than politicians, but sometimes political parties during election cycles. So for example, in New Zealand, there's a tradition that you brief the incoming minister. There's something called the BIM. When the election is announced and everyone's out electioneering, the policymakers are busy writing the briefing to incoming ministers, whoever that might be, saying these are the issues, here is the evidence. And so if you've got deep and trusted relationships between researchers and policymakers, there are windows in the political cycle where they'll pick up the phone and say, hey, what's on your mind? And just bombarding the media or random officials from random ministries with the data isn't going to work, but understanding the entry points can be really successful.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Very good. Very interesting.
I
Next
have
question.
a microphone.
Oh, here.
Good morning, and thank you very much to all the speakers. My name is Bernadette Highland-Wood. I'm with the QUT Center for Data Science. Kia ora, Professor Gerard. I haven't spoken to you since the COVID-19 pandemic, so thank you for being here. And my question is, this room has probably got quite a high percentage of people who are statisticians and bioinformaticists, et cetera, who help with the pandemic. And so I ask Agnes and Professor Gerard what insights perhaps you have on what do you feel in your respective nations who were very good about data sharing in many nations in Africa, because they have a lot of experience with pandemics. What advice, what have we learned, and what could we all be doing as people who are in some capacity data stewards or work with national and local level data stewards to be better in our responses to the next pandemic, which could come in 2 weeks, 2 years, 10 years, but it is coming, and in the careers of many of the people in this room. Thank you.
Agnes, if you want to answer first, and then.
Yes, I could go first. Thanks for the great question. And what we've learned over through the pandemic is that one, data sharing was critical to solve the global disaster that had really come. And I think it was one of the moments that every person who held their data, every person or probably every government at that time realized the value of sharing data, even though it wasn't 100% effective. Speaking from the African context, I think we saw a lot of, for the first time, a lot of governments putting their data out there, shepherding their data to continental platforms where the cases were really visualized, countries were comparing and reformulating their response strategies only because the data was made available at continental level and, of course, at national level. So what we've learned is during pandemics, I think the nuances around data sharing tend to drop because everybody realizes without sharing the data, it's only going to be worse. So we've seen a lot of data sharing agreements or data policies evolving after the pandemic. Some countries that didn't have data protection frameworks or policies, continental data frameworks were also really put in place after the pandemic. And I think it highlighted and underscored the need to share data, but also emphasized that data sharing in itself is not a problem. It's only if you're sharing personal identifying information, and that making policymakers and custodians understand that was the best solution to addressing the pandemic. The second was trust. Somebody said data moves at the speed of trust. What the data was going to be used for, was it going to inform vaccine delivery? Is the data going to inform a new strategy? Is the data going to benefit the data producers? So around pandemics, and as one comes in the nearest future, issues around data trust are going to be very important. And I think it's a lesson that came out clearly. The third opportunity is to work with policymakers who are really the custodians for most of these policies that allow data sharing across the continent. We've been privileged to work with many of the continental bodies that oversee data sharing at continental level, like the Africa Union, the Africa CDC, the Pan-African Parliament, Africa peer review mechanisms, and all these entities are moving closer to realizing data has to be put in, shared in formats that are going to allow early response to pandemics. And of course, the last will be creating platforms that are going to allow, I think, harmonized data sets to be put in a manner that can really inform continental evidence generation during pandemics. So we've really learned trust, the value of sharing data, understanding sharing in itself is not bad, but only sharing, ensuring that the data is protected, it's private, and also confidentiality is maintained, and also having platforms where this is collected and used in real-time manner to inform the pandemic. I think that's what we've learned over the years, but happy to hear from the others. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Agnes and Juliet.
Yeah, I agree. Trust is the big word, and I'd add to that culture and pragmatism, I think. So we were lucky to be led by leaders who communicated freely the data we had with all its warts and uncertainties, and it really wasn't very good data at the beginning. And pragmatism. So we spent a lot of time plotting graphs of really quite dodgy data and sharing them widely so that people knew what we knew, and also the limitations of that data. It's all archived on the web if people are interested. But creating a culture where the leadership shared data and shared uncertainty and created the expectation that the data might shift was, I think, critical at the beginning. That got harder and harder as the pandemic wore on and trust eroded, because uncertainty became seen as a weakness and a point of division. But if there was another one tomorrow, I think that would still be a good approach to share the knowns and the unknowns, and to quote Rumsfeld, the unknown unknowns all at once, and have that culture set from the top.
Thank you, thank you. I don't know, we have one more question. I think There are two questions. Okay, these two questions, and that will be it.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for this amazing session and the great insights. My name is Cyrus Walter, and I'm with the Co-Data Executive Committee standing for the early careers. And I want to connect to Mercè's first point on this discussion, which is the early careers perspective on a lot of these matters of interdisciplinarity. So as an early career, you're often punished for going different routes that are not exactly your discipline and connecting interdisciplinary with variety of things, for example, science communication. Would you recommend to still take that bullet and still go into science communication for a semester or with industry for a semester or a completely different discipline that is adjacent that might give you some other insights? And if so, what can the community do to make that step easier towards being a more complete scientist? Thank you.
Definitely. My career path was so wonky. Be brave, do it. And the community can just learn to support it. I mean, we're going to need more people who are brave and go off the path.
Yeah, I would just say that I think we were talking about this before the panel, that there is this huge gap in the ecosystem of research in society where we fund research, but then we haven't really thought through how research makes it into the public and policy making. I think that early career scientists and researchers that really know more than we do about how to do this well is going to be critical because we are so unprepared, so unprepared. Yeah.
I agree. I agree. Agnes, just very briefly, so we can have one more question. Sorry, we don't hear you now.
No, sorry, I was on mute.
Yes.
Yes, I would also just encourage you to really take those broad steps and step into different disciplines that will enhance your career. Just probably gone through the same when I just started my career as a statistician. I was applying for grants, and the first comment from a reviewer was like, no, you are a statistician, you cannot do clinical research. I was like, no, this cannot happen. So you take the bullet, be bold, and it will definitely enhance your career along the way. So that's my advice.
Great.
Over.
Wonderful. So, Anna, one more question. Yes.
Here.
Oh, okay. I think so. We'll have two more questions. Very quick, very brief.
Okay, very briefly. Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Diana, and I'm professor at the Catalan Research Foundation in Barcelona. I have a question for Anna. I fully agree with your proposal, but I was wondering what happens when this data is biased or non-existing, because as you know very well, in many contexts, and Agnes' talk was showing a bit that, we don't have data for many contexts. I work in the humanities and in the social sciences in the Latin American context, and there is no data. So how do you propose to validate the proxy in those cases that are, unfortunately, a lot of them? Thank you.
Yes, I think we need to collect the data. And I think that if you make a strong case for why this is an important question and there are no data, there will be funding for it. If we start, especially if it's an area where we don't have a lot of knowledge, and we start developing that knowledge based on data that are really far from what we need or what we're thinking about, then that knowledge may be completely wrong. So I don't want to say, oh, because it's not perfect, let's not do research on it. I think that's also very dangerous, and you talked about it in your talk. But I also think that we need to at least have a sense of how imperfect it is and sort of in what direction, what is the kind of bias that we may have. I also think that when you collect data on something that we haven't collected data yet, that can open completely new research areas, and it's very rewarded across disciplines, very rewarded.
That's great. Thanks for the question and the answer. And one more question, the final one. Yes. Yes. Oh, well, I don't know.
I thought you already been given a mic.
Okay, almost there.
Thank you. I'm Setia Pramana from Polytechnic Statistika STIS, Indonesia. Just one quick question. Again, it's a great pleasure to have all of you in the panel, and I will learn a lot. One quick question about the how to connect the research, right? Scientific. Also, you mentioned about validation, transparency, everything for our in research and scientists with the policy. What will be the role of national statistics offices, like in your country, right? Because that's something actually yeah, it couldn't happen if you see example, for example, one government maybe doesn't care about the research, right? Because this National Statistics Office should link between the research we have done for statistics and also validation, etc., in the policy section. So what do you think about the role of the National Statistics Office? That's it.
Okay, the role of National Statistics Office, and I will do that very, like, half a minute each. Agnes, if you want to start, and if you have something to
yes.
say.
I just say, particularly in the African context, they remain critical because they do hold most of the administrative data. And as we are in the era really of collecting big data sets to inform most of the evidence generation, NSOs are really critical. And what we need to say is to see them embed maybe more different opportunities to have young researchers use that data for evidence generation and feeding that back to the to the different policymakers. But for now, they remain critical, and that data sets from statistical offices and also training opportunities for young researchers remain very important. So they are still critical in a nutshell. Over.
Thank you.
Yeah, hugely important, probably need empowering and resourcing, and in some jurisdictions, trust can be an issue because it's government data, so some researchers keep their data sets out. So big topic, but yes, very important, and it would have been better if we'd all used those offices more in the pandemic, but I don't think many of them were necessarily set up to be fast responders.
Yeah, I would say, thinking of the kinds of topics that I research, is one is maybe be more, listen more to experts to identify what needs to be measured, because sometimes we don't have data on critical things. For example, in Latin America, organized crime now, it's like one of the most important obstacles for development, and we have very little data measuring just prevalence of a lot of the phenomena related to it. And then also listen to insights from researchers for improving the quality of data. So not what to measure, but how to measure, and measure it better. Leave it at there.
Very good. So on that note, we end this session, and thank you to the audience. That's such an engaged audience. To the speakers.